Hello there, people of the internet. I have the air conditioner going in the background. You guys are going to hear it. Yeah, it's like 98 degrees or something here in Florida right now. We are in the middle of summer, and I'm right in the middle of Central Florida. It is hot. I'm not turning that AC off. That being said, we should still have a fun video. I was talking with some other content creators, and we had elected to go ahead and do a little collaboration using these right here. These are Spanish Mausers, and essentially we want to do a little collaboration talking about our personal pros and cons of these Spanish Mausers, and then we will talk about these other collaborators' pros and cons of these Spanish Mausers. So that being said, this video is going to kind of be broken up into two parts. The first part where I go over my pros and cons of these Mausers, and then the second part, which I will probably film on another day once we get things a little bit more squared away, just due to scheduling. I probably won't be able to do this all in one day. Down the road, once we figure out what these other people's pros and cons are, then I'll go ahead and make a second part to this video, which is still going to be in this video, just later on in the video, where I go over their pros and cons and I kind of give my input on that stuff. That being said, all these creators, you can go ahead, go down into the description. You're going to find a bunch of links to their channels. I recommend going to check them out. So, I guess we'll go ahead and we'll start with the pros. And we're going to start with like really obvious things and then get a little bit more into niche things. So first off, I was going to do this with multiple of my Spanish Mausers. I have multiple Mausers. They're all either the 1893 pattern or the 1916 pattern, which is just an updated version of the 1893. Each of them kind of has their own unique thing going on, but I think that I'll be able to cover everything just showing off this one Mauser versus going into my gun safe and having to dig out all the other Mausers, because most of my points can basically be made here. Okay, so first off, quite an obvious one, the Mauser 93 is a cock-on close action. What that means is as you cycle the bolt, once you push it forward, this actually throws a lot of people off. I've noticed that because they're used to a cock-on open action. Once you push it forward, you have to fight spring tension to fully cock and close that rifle. Now, the reason why I call that a benefit is because whenever you are essentially opening this rifle, you don't have to fight the spring tension of cocking the rifle while also trying to unseat the brass that was just fired inside the chamber. You only have to focus on the force it takes to get that brass out of the chamber versus having to fight that spring tension. That being said, especially with modern manufactured ammunition, really not that big of a problem. But it does help if you're shooting something that is a little bit sticky, maybe something that's lacquered, maybe some military surplus stuff that isn't quite right, etc., etc. I just find that a cock-on closed system just lends itself to being easier with this older ammunition. And a lot of the ammunition that I fire is going to be surplus stuff. That being said, cock-on close action can also be a little bit faster than a cock-on open action. I think a lot of the reason why it can be faster, a lot of times whenever I see people trying to run a cock-on open action nice and quickly, they essentially turn their rifle because they have to fight that spring tension and the tension of pulling that round out of the chamber while they're opening their rifle. So whenever I see people fighting that spring tension, they'll turn their rifle. It slows them down, not a significant amount, but it does slow them down, versus something like a cock-on close action where you're fighting that spring tension, pushing it forward, you're not turning your rifle, and you can work your action quite quickly. Now granted, this doesn't have the short bolt throw that a Lee Enfield has or something like that, but I still see it as one of the added benefits. Another benefit I want to add, a lot of your, especially your more modern hunting rifles, they'll actually have kind of like a pistol grip style stock, versus most of your Oviedo Mausers, which are going to have more of a smooth stock. A lot of people like that pistol grip style stock, but going through the jungles of Florida, I have had that catch on things, and this right here is just such a sleek design. It just doesn't catch on things as much. Not only that, but you got a little less wood, you got a little less weight, so I imagine that probably does help out a little bit as well. Most of these Oviedo Mausers that are the 1893 pattern, most of them that you find here in the United States are going to be carbines, however it is you feel like pronouncing that. Of course you're right and everyone else is wrong. Most of them are going to be fairly short, lightweight little rifles. Of course you can find the longer version of these rifles out there, but like I said, most of them that are out there on the United States market are going to be these shorter rifles, and shorter rifles are just always nicer to have. Can't quite remember the barrel length on these. I'd say I got no idea. Honestly, if I were to come up with a number, it would just be completely random. Let me look it up real quick. Alright, according to the internet, it is a 22-inch barrel. My guess was going to be about 20 inches, so that sounds about right. Versus some of your longer rifles, which can be 28 to 32 inches, depending on who manufactures them. I'm not sure what the longer rifles of the Spanish, or the longer barrels of the Spanish rifles are, but I do know that there are some pretty long Mausers out there. But most of what you're going to find are carbines, carbines, like I said, however it is you feel like pronouncing that, and that's just a really light, handy little rifle in comparison to some of the longer stuff that you might come across. Alright, another big pro behind these rifles. This is one of those pros that is actually, like, legitimately a pro. If you want a light shooting rifle, you can find these rifles in 7mm Mauser. If you want a good hard-hitting rifle, you can find them in essentially 7.62 NATO. It's actually 7.62 SETME, but it runs 7.62 NATO just fine. So, two big benefits. Not only that, but much like with some other firearms out there, if you want to swap out your calibers from 7.62 NATO to 7mm Mauser, what I do, because they both have the same exact head on those cartridges, I just swap out the barrel and receiver. I got a barrel and receiver in both of these calibers. I can literally just take the barreled receiver on one, put the old barreled receiver on, and I can swap out between 7mm and 7.62 NATO at will. Same bolt head, same bolts. The sights, they line up well enough for the distances that I shoot at. Whenever you are swapping out your barreled receiver, you might get lucky. Maybe your barreled receiver already has sights on it. In my particular case, I have one pair of sights that I have to swap between the barreled receivers, but it works well enough. Long story short, caliber swapping for these rifles is actually quite easy because everything just lines up between 7mm Mauser and 7.62 NATO. Okay, I think that's pretty much all the pros that I can really legitimately think of for these rifles in particular. Let's go ahead and start looking at some of the cons. Well, actually, I'll throw in one more pro. It's got a very strong action. The Mauser actions are just known to be extremely strong, and I have Turkish rifles that are also a 93 pattern that handle 8mm Mauser just fine, which is quite the powerhouse of a cartridge. I fired Turkish 8mm Mauser through that as well, which is a powerhouse version of that powerhouse of a cartridge, and it handles it just fine. So, very strong action. Okay, now we're going to start getting into some cons. So the first thing I want to go ahead and point out, Spanish steel is questionable, especially from the time period that we're talking about. Especially. I keep saying especially, and people are like, no, that's not how you pronounce that. As far as I'm concerned, if you know what I'm saying, that's good enough for me. So, Spanish steel is questionable. I've heard good things, I've heard bad things. People have said, no, it's fine. Well, from my own personal experience, I have had one of these Oviedo Mausers blow up in my face because I fired 308 through it. So, yeah. I'm sure someone's gonna go into the comments and they're gonna say, hey, I fired 308 through mine and it's fine. How much 308 have you fired through it? Because I fired probably about 1,500 rounds of 308 through mine, and it eventually stretched out the headspace and blew up my receiver, and that was quite the day. Yeah, that was quite the day. That actually happened with, actually a rifle I showed off on the channel a long time ago. But anyway, Spanish steel is questionable, and I mean, it makes sense. 308, higher pressure, different headspace than 7.62 NATO. It's just, the rifle's not designed for that cartridge. Maybe if it was set up to 308 specs, to where the headspace didn't have that very slight difference, then maybe it would have lasted a little bit longer. But yeah, I have had one of these blow up in my face, and I'm going to go ahead and call it the Spanish steel, because I've heard that Spanish steel is softer than other steels out there. That being said, if you use the cartridge that is actually designed for the rifle, it runs just fine. Like this one right here, I have no idea how many thousands of rounds of 7.62 NATO I have through it. So, yeah, okay, the rifle works fine, but yeah, I'm still going to go ahead and throw out that Spanish steel is questionable. Alright, another pretty big con with these rifles, especially if you're going to look for one that is in its original configuration. Throughout the past, say 5, maybe 7 years, these things have climbed in price to the point to where I would call them not worth it. Nowadays, people are wanting $400+ for one of these rifles. And at that price point, you're better off going and get yourself like a Czech Mauser or a Yugoslavian Mauser or something like that. These guys right here just are not worth that price point. They're not worth the same value as a 98 action from a country that manufactures these rifles better. Now, I guess that is kind of speculation. Some people out there would say, yes, they're absolutely worth that price point. Some people would say, hey, they're worth whatever it is people are willing to pay, and some people are willing to pay that. I am not. Personally, I'd take that 400 bucks, I'd go get myself a more modern rifle. It's wild how much money people want for some of this surplus. You get yourself a sporterized one, they go for a little bit less. That's one of the reasons why, like, 3 of my 4 Spanish Mausers are sporterized, but I managed to win this one at an auction for not a lot of money, so I'm quite pleased about that. Alright, another con. This nose cap. Actually, all the nose caps on all of my Spanish rifles, just because of whatever goes on with the Spanish wood, they get loose. And I mean, this rifle is like 100 years old at this point, so I'm going to cut it some slack. But I have other 100-year-old rifles that don't have loose nose caps. And it's just because this spring ratana right here, just, it presses into the wood, compacts the wood, like the wood is just not as hard as some of the other rifles out there. And just over the course of a century, these nose caps get a little loose. And there's been a couple of times where this thing right here has like popped off on me. Definitely not something I would want to rely on for a bayonet charge or something like that, but I also don't really foresee me bayonet charging anything. But yeah, the Spanish wood, just a little soft for my taste, and it does not hold up to the 100 years that this rifle has been seeing things. Alright, another con I'll go ahead and throw out. The sights on these rifles are difficult to see. Now, that might just be me. I know I can't see very well, but just the V-notch on these sights, I'm sure a lot of people will agree, is a little bit too small to be able to really significantly pick up. As a matter of fact, I might just file this particular one out a little bit, just so I can make my front sight acquisitions a little bit easier. But yeah, the sights on the Mausers are just a little bit difficult to see. A Pro with the 1916 model, they zero out for 100 yards versus the 1893 model, which I think has a 300-yard zero if we're talking about the 7mm Mauser. So you gotta like aim underneath your target in order to actually hit your target versus something like this right here, which you just kind of aim point of impact if you're within 100 yards, and you should be pretty close to hitting that point of impact. Okay, I guess the last one I have. The extractors on these are finicky and weak. Like, if they're original extractors, just for some reason the Spanish Mauser extractors on their rifles just don't hold up really well to the test of time. This particular one, I had to finagle a little bit. I'm not entirely certain on where this extractor came from, but it is a 93 extractor. It just did not quite fit this Mauser. Maybe it was for some other 93. But yeah, the extractors can be quite finicky. Alright, bit of an interruption. It is the next day. I just did not have time to finish the video yesterday, so we're gonna continue it today. My air conditioner's on, but I just turned it on. It is hot as hell inside of this room. I would sit here and wait for it to cool down, but once again, I have a very busy schedule and I got things to do. I want to add one more pro to these Oviedo Mausers. I'm not sure how the Spanish cut their rifling inside of their barrels. I don't know how similar it is to other rifles, but I've ran 308 black powder loads through a good number of different rifles, and anyone who's ever ran black powder loads in, like, modern cartridges knows how rapidly the accuracy deteriorates. The accuracy of black powder through this particular rifle doesn't deteriorate, like, at all. I had, like, actually, I got a buddy of mine, whenever I had brought this rifle out with some of my homemade black powder that burns fairly clean, I had, like, a Ziploc bag filled with, I don't know, I had 120 to 150 rounds of black powder 308, give or take. And I ran all those through this rifling. I was clacking a 6-inch steel target at 100 yards regularly with it. So I don't know how the Spanish cut their rifling, but it seems to work really, really well with black powder, which is pretty awesome because I didn't have to worry about that lack of accuracy as the black powder fouling build up inside the rifle. Alright, now comes the fun part where I go over the pros and cons of the other people I'm doing the collaboration with. And I've kind of skimmed over these. I never really gave them much thought, so we're gonna cut kind of a... oh, what would you call it? A live action... well, not, I guess not live action. A first view reaction of what it is I actually think about what these guys are saying. So first off, Mississippi Mauser. We're gonna go through some of his pros. He says he loves 7mm Mauser because it's a light recoil with good velocities. He says intense velocities. They're not that intense in comparison to what we have nowadays. But I definitely understand what he's saying. Very light recoil, especially for the velocity that you get. 7mm Mauser is probably one of my favorite all-time cartridges because of exactly that reason. It's powerful enough to be able to handle whatever it is you need to handle. I typically load mine with like 160 grain bullets, and I'll get 2,400 feet per second, maybe 2,500 feet per second, depending on barrel length and velocity and things like that, out of my 7mm Mausers. But the recoil is a lot less than something you'd get with like a 150 grain 308 round. He says that the straight stock, without the pistol grip on it, is good for small-statured people to be able to get a proper grip on it. I am like over 6 feet tall, and I'm not sure how well it comes up on camera, but I'm quite a large dude, so I can't add much to that. Personally, I could foresee it, because there are some times where I gotta kind of finagle my grip on this thing a little bit, and I gotta think about how I want to grip this thing versus something else that has a pistol grip on it that doesn't require that. His next pro is that it's a Mauser action. I think I already touched on this. Mauser actions are nice and strong, but he also brought up that extractors for these rifles are not all that great, so I think we are in agreement on that. As a matter of fact, I think I actually had those in my pros. Yeah, Mauser, nice strong action. Extractors, those leave something to be desired. As you get to like the 98 model, the extractor is a little bit better, but that might be because the 98 models that I'm used to were made by Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia and Germany, and they just seem to have better steels than the Spanish. I know I have had several Spanish Mauser extractors break over my time. They're just not all that great. Maybe on some other Model 93s. I know I have a Turkish Model 93 and the extractor has never broken on that one. Maybe on other Model 93s there's not so much of an issue. Alright, he also talks about how accurate the rifles are. They are, I'll go ahead and give it to him, extremely accurate rifles, especially considering their age. A lot of these guns are like over 100 years old at this point, and they're still smacking steel at 100 yards. I've seen people print sub-MOA groups with these things with hand-loaded ammunition. The consistency has to be there. You gotta slug your barrel, make sure you're using proper diameter bullets if you want exact fitment. If you use a little bit undersized or a little bit oversized bullets, then you're going to suffer with some accuracy issues. But yeah, 100%, these right here can be quite accurate rifles. This particular one is a really good example of that. He talks about how these rifles are still in easily findable ammunitions. Like, the ammunition for these rifles are easy to find. 7mm Mauser is still made to this day by multiple different companies. And of course, 7.62 NATO exists. It's surplus. It's by far the cheaper option. It's available all over. You can get it literally anywhere. 7.62 NATO is just one of those overwhelmingly abundant cartridges like 9mm and a 223 or 5.56. So, yeah, definitely has a big benefit for that if you're going to go the 7.62 NATO route with these rifles. He likes the history behind these rifles. He likes the American-Spanish War history behind these rifles. This particular one is a 1916 model, but just the 1893 Spanish rifle in general. He likes the history behind the Spanish-American War, and he likes the history behind the Spanish Civil War. He's never really saw use in World War II, which is one of the things that makes people absolutely flock towards Mausers, and that's one of the reasons why Spanish Mausers are a little on the less desirable side in comparison to like a German Mauser, but they saw a lot of use in the Spanish Civil War. I recommend touching up on what exactly went down in that war because it was a very violent and bloody conflict, and we can basically guarantee that all of these rifles that were in the Spanish armory at the time saw use in that Civil War. He also says that his Mausers are significantly lighter than any other Mauser. You know what? I'm inclined to agree with that. I never really pieced that together, but I've got quite a few different Mauser carbines, And I think just the design of the 1893, this particular model, I wish I had like a Chilean 95 carbine to compare it to or something like that. Combine that with the soft wood that, although it does have the con of deforming rather easily, it does feel a little bit lighter weight. So yeah, I'm actually inclined to agree on that one. If I compare this, the weight of this, with like a German 98, Car 98, that Car 98 is definitely bulkier and heavier than this nice lightweight little carbine here. Alright, now we're moving on to Yuri Gunderson. He's another creator that is taking part in this. So, his pros: 7mm, great cartridge. Already went over it, I agree. Fantastic cartridge. The history behind the Spanish Civil War, already went over that. There's a lot that went into that conflict, and these rifles have seen quite a bit. I recommend looking into it if you don't know. He likes the 93 action and it being control feed. That's something that I dislike about the 98 action. These rifles being control feed, the magazine follower and the spring tension has to be essentially spot on in order to get that rim properly up inside of the ejector, like consistently and reliably. And there's been multiple times where I've had feeding issues with these rifles just because they're 100 years old and they're worn out and they're control feed systems. So that's something I don't like about them. The 98 Mauser extractor kind of hops over the rim significantly easier than one of these, where you gotta kind of force it and you risk breaking your extractor, especially on one of these. That's just how a control feed system works. The rim of the cartridge is supposed to go up under the extractor, like direct from the magazine, and the magazine has to be on point for that to happen, and these are really old guns and that doesn't always happen. He says that they're underappreciated rifles. I agree with that to an extent. There are definitely some underappreciated aspects of these rifles, especially in terms of the history behind them, but then there's the people that are selling them, and they're asking way too much money for them. He says that you can find them at good deals if you are patient, and you can find anything at a good deal if you're patient. So, yeah, I agree, but I also disagree. These are underappreciated except for the people that are selling them, in which case they think that they have way more than they actually have. Alright, on to his cons. The dangers of those that were converted to 7.62 NATO for the modern shooter. I had one of these blow up. I think I already said that on this video. I had one of these blow up after a bunch of 308 shooting, and that's just because of my ignorance for the time period. 308, these are not designed for 308. People will tell you it's fine, but it does cause headspace to walk, as I noticed, and I did detonate my receiver on one of these. So, yeah, don't run 308 through one of these. Treat them as a 7.62 NATO rifle. He says his preference is for a modern pistol grip. We already went over this. I guess if you're a big guy, the pistol grip would probably be the better option, but personally I like this right here because this does not catch on near as much like brush and whatnot if I'm carrying it through the jungles of Florida. Alright, here's one that I might have already talked about. I can't remember. I filmed this video yesterday. The sights are hard to pick up on these rifles, and I think I've already discussed this. I talked about filing out the rear sights just to make it a little bit easier. Just the rear sight V-notch is so tiny, and especially with someone with eyes like mine, it's just a little bit on the difficult side to pick that up. Alright, now Movie Maker 225. He's another collaborator in this collaboration YouTube video that we're doing here. As a matter of fact, I think he's actually the one who called for this collaboration. So, yeah, you guys will have to go watch his stuff. So, the pros. In this particular case, he's talking about the 1893 model. I was talking about the Oviedo Spanish Mauser specifically, the 1893/1916 models. But let's hear what he has to say. Pros. He says he loves the control feed. We already talked about that. I don't like it just because these Mausers are old and it causes feeding issues now that things are worn out. He says he's a fan of caulk-on closed Mausers. I agree with that, 110%. We already went over that in the main video. Big fan of 7mm Mauser. Seems like everyone in this video, little series we got going on here, enjoys the 7mm Mauser for good reason. He says it's stripper clip fed. How did I not bring up that it's stripper clip fed? That is the easiest way to feed a bolt action rifle if you want any kind of real speed. open up your action. There's little slots right here, and you take a stripper clip, in this case of 5 rounds, you push it into your magazine, and then you just kind of close your action, knock the stripper clip out of the way. It is a really good system, like really fast for reloading these rifles. He says it's the first Mauser with a flush fit magazine. That is correct. The 1891 that came before this had a single stack magazine. I think it jutted out the bottom of the rifle, and I have one of those, and especially with like the lock nut style of system they used on that magazine, it gets caught on things pretty easy. Alright, now we're going on to the cons. It looks like a bigger list than the pros. I wish the 1893 had a way to recock the rifle without having to open the bolt. I agree on that. There's been a couple of times with old rifles where I have some kind of malfunction with the trigger mechanism or the sear drop mechanism, firing mechanism, something has gone on, and I have not been able to grab that cocking piece on the back to prevent anything from firing. So, yeah, I agree with that one 100%. As a matter of fact, I had an 1891 that had some issues with the bolts. It was like corroded or something on the inside of the bolt. Pull the trigger, it started dropping, stopped dropping, was past the sear. I mean, what do you do in that situation? There was nothing to grab onto, and then after a couple of moments, it finally broke past whatever crap was inside of that bolt body, and fired down, and it ended up going off after several seconds. He said he would have liked the 100-meter battle sight instead of the 300-meter. This right here is a 1916 model, although it is still an 1893 Mauser, and it actually has a 200-yard zero on it. It might be 100-yard. It's a little bit under that 200-yard zero. It says 200-yard, but my sight goes a little bit further back beyond that. So we're going to call it a 200-yard because I don't see a 1 on these right here. He says the 1893 is a fairly long rifle, so his particular example of an 1893 rifle is one of those long versions, and I think that we discussed how they can be found out there in their long versions, but of course, they are also carbines. You can go out there and find carbine versions of this rifle. Okay, well, that is all of the pros and cons that we had. He says, oh yeah, he starts going on about other people's decisions with their pros and cons. So we will let them react with that in their video versus me reading it off. All in all, I got no idea. I have no idea how to end this video now that we've reached this part. I like these rifles. I like the fact that I can load them with black powder and shoot them really, really easily and regularly. I find that the infield rifles as well, like the #1 Mark III, like your 303 British rifles, those also have a lot of, how would I say it? They don't have the fouling issues that other bolt-action rifles have if you load the cartridges with black powder. I think it's because 303 British was originally designed around a black powder system. The infield rifling itself was designed around smokeless powder. Like, in their particular case, it was cordite. But let's just give it the benefit of the doubt, and let's just assume that they thought that potentially there was going to be some sort of instance where black powder 303 was going to be used, so they had rifling, maybe, that was intended to not lose much accuracy as you shot. I know the Lee Metford rifling, that was kind of designed around that ideology, but the infield rifling was designed around smokeless powder, but for some reason, the infield rifling inside of my infield, specifically my #1 Mark III, it still holds up extremely well in comparison to other rifles and other kinds of rifling with black powder fouling. So, I don't really know why I started talking about infield rifles, but here we go. I had a really good time making this video on my Spanish Mausers, and I hope that everybody else did as well. Thanks for watching. I appreciate your time. Like, subscribe, share. Description below has a link to all sorts of stuff. Go check it out. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Oh God, what time it is? What time is it? I got somewhere to be. I forgot all about that. I've done this. Bonnie and Clyde be damned. Poor man's Garen. It's a shame that bolt-action shotguns aren't more mainstream.